All right, welcome everyone. So today we are diving into something pretty strange and really provocative. It's a text that tries to build a logical case for a figure it calls the writer. And it does this with a thought experiment that's so extreme, it basically claims your life could literally depend on how you answer it. So yeah, let's break down how this whole thing supposedly works.
So let's just jump right in with this central kind of mysterious quote from the source. Now, the text argues this isn't just poetic language. It has a very specific real-world meaning, that this figure shows up first with the most important information way before anyone else in the world can even get there.
Okay, so to get our heads around this, because it is a dense argument, we're going to break it down into 5 main parts. We'll start with who this writer is and what they claim. Then we'll look at this weird mechanism called the clock and crossbow. After that, a super high-stakes test in the fire, then this idea of a collective delusion, and finally, we'll get into how the text separates truth, belief, and reality. All right, first up, let's get a handle on who we're even talking about here. Who is this central figure, and what is the extraordinary claim that's being made about them? So the source brings up this figure it calls the writer, but you'll notice they aren't defined by a name you'd recognize. Instead, their whole identity, the whole reason they matter, is tied to one single action, showing up first with crucial info. This whole idea of being ahead of the curve, well, it's absolutely central to the entire argument. And the text makes this really bold claim about the writer's arrival. It says it's going to be this undeniable, universally persuasive event. And to put it in perspective, it frames this as something even more convincing, more impactful than a major historical benchmark for belief. Okay, so you might be wondering, how on earth does the source try to prove a claim like that? And this is where things get, well, a little weird and mechanical. It puts forward this unique logical device, this mechanism, to test its own claims. The entire argument is built on this concept the source calls the clock. Okay, so this isn't a real clock you'd hang on a wall. You gotta think of it more like a logical framework, a thought experiment machine. The source even calls it a transformer because it can metaphorically change its shape, like from a clock into a crossbow, for example, all to test if a claim is valid or not. So for this whole clock thing to even work, the source sets up this conflict between two opposing sides, which it just labels blue and red. The basic idea is that blue makes some kind of claim. It's the one holding the tension. Red's whole job is to challenge it, to try and open what blue closes. You can think of it as a logical stress test, really. Okay, so here's where it all clicks into place. The source says this clock transforms into a loaded crossbow. Picture a timeline stretched out, super tight, like a crossbow string. Blue holds a claim, which creates all this tension. Then red comes along and tries to disprove that claim. And here's the absolute key. If red's challenge fails, the source claims reality itself pulls the trigger. The whole point is that in this system, objective truth wins, and it wins with, very real consequences. Okay, so we've got this wild, conceptual crossbow. The next part explains how it's actually used in what has to be one of the most high-stakes thought experiments you can imagine. And this is where the source looks you, the reader, right in the eye. It's not some philosophical question from a distance. It's a direct challenge, an invitation to a test it calls sitting in the line of fire. So the setup for this test is actually pretty simple, but the stakes are incredibly high. You sit in the path of this conceptual crossbow. Your survival? It depends completely on whether you can logically prove that the writer's claim is just a subjective belief or some kind of delusion. If you can't do that, well, reality pulls the trigger. Okay, so if this reality the source describes is so real, why doesn't everyone see it? Well, the text says there's a specific psychological and social obstacle in the way. And to really hammer this point home, the text gives us this detailed hypothetical scenario. And it actually uses a real-world figure, the famous atheist Richard Dawkins, to make its case and illustrate this idea of a societal blind spot. So the whole thing kicks off with this exchange. The source presents Dawkins' who cares as the absolute heart of the delusion. It's this dismissal that's rooted in a core assumption that the writer or Christ just can't show up in a way that you can actually verify. So in this scenario, Dawkins is totally on board with this test. He's just so sure of his worldview that he believes any panel of experts, even once he gets to pick himself, will back him up and prove the writer's claim is nonsense. But then comes the twist. The experts, who have no idea what's at stake, are asked this fundamental question about the nature of truth itself. Their answer, which is totally objective, accidentally validates the writer's core claim. And in the logic of this whole scenario, it actually triggers the crossbow.
And that right there, that is what the source is getting at when it talks about a collective delusion. It's when a whole society is so confident in its shared beliefs that it just assumes their objective reality. And that makes it totally impossible to see an alternative, even if it's staring them right in the face.
All right, this brings us to the grand finale, the absolute heart of the argument. This is the logic the source uses to draw a very, very hard line between what it calls objective truth and what it calls subjective belief. The whole thing, the crossbow, the line of fire, all of it, it all boils down to the answer to this one single question. This is what the writer supposedly asks the person whose life is on the line. So to even answer that, you have to understand the source's very strict definitions. It defines truth, with a capital T, as having the final say over belief. Basically, the idea is that truth can override belief. It can open doors that belief has slammed shut. But belief? It has absolutely no power to override truth.
So, what happens if you're sitting in that line of fire and you answer belief? According to the text, that's a fatal mistake. The source is basically asserting that reality itself proves that only truth has this ultimate power. And to bet against that is to lose, well, everything.
So let's wrap our heads around this. The main takeaway here is that if you accept the source's framework, especially this whole clop and crossbow mechanism, then it concludes that the writer's claim is justified. It's presented not as something you have to believe in, but as a truth that, in the author's world, has already been logically proven. And that, right there, is the final challenge the text leaves us with. It completely reframes the conversation. It's positioning its argument not as something to be taken on faith, but as a reality that it claims can be verified. And it really forces you to ask some tough questions about the nature of your own certainty.